Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Iowa State Cyclones Live here on the Voice of College Football Network. I'm your host, Levi Stevenson, also the managing editor over at Wide Right and Natty Light out of our SB Nation. Here again this week with another kind of off-season episode here. There's not a lot going on just yet. This week, we are expecting the House settlement to come down in college football, and there's lots and lots of behind-the-scenes talk with Greg Sankey in the SEC and lots of other things going on, and it's just there's a lot in flux right now that it's too much. It's too much. There's too much up in the air right now to talk too much about it. But rest assured, when all that stuff comes down, we will talk about it as far as the House settlement goes, and all the details along with that, and some of these crazy proposals by the SEC and the Big Ten. Going to four AQs per per conference with some other stuff thrown in, and them clearly trying to push towards a dedicated league for the two of them, or a small league, as Greg Sankey continues to be the big bad of college football, by far the most nefarious actor that we've seen in college football in a long time. But until we get more clarity on any of that, we're going to do a more fun off-season episode here, especially for Iowa State fans that'll remember some of these names. We are going to do the all quarter century team. So this is going to be anybody that has starting in the year 2000 until now, because we've had 25 seasons of college football since the turn of the 2000s, so the beginning of the 21st century. So we are going to go through and do an all Iowa State team for players for starting in 2000. There could be overlap theoretically. I don't think I have any players on this list that overlapped between the late 90s and early 2000s, though there may be a couple guys that would be in consideration for something like that. A couple criteria here. I considered the overall impact of every player, but in general, because it is an all-century team, you're counting in an entire career. So guys that didn't play 4 years here, definitely we're at a little bit of a disadvantage just because of they couldn't make as much of an impact at Iowa State as other 4-year guys could have. So I don't know if I've got anybody on the list that was a JUCO or not. I don't think I do. But it's one of those where 4-year guys are gonna get the nod in a lot of these, just because they were able to impact the program on a longer time frame than a JUCO guy. And you'll see that we'll talk about those when we get to those too. But as always, as we get going through here, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you get any agreements, disagreements, if you think I'm crazy on one of these, if you think I'm missing some names, definitely eager to hear some of those. But we'll get started with a couple of these. First ones are going to be very pretty. They're going to be pretty straightforward. I was thinking about doing a full 2 deep of these, but it would get tricky, I think, once you get out of the skill positions, especially once you get into the offensive line. It's not that there haven't been good players, but I think you're really splitting hairs when you get to the offensive line, getting into a 2 deep. And I'll be the first to admit that offensive line is not necessarily my expertise of the way skill position. The way I can look at the quarterback position and the skill positions, and give a pretty good analysis on those. Offensive line is a more specialized thing. But we can all look back and say, okay, this was a guy that really deserves some significant recognition here, for their position too. So like I said, first, some of these are going to be very obvious, and a pattern you're going to notice is that a good chunk of these guys played for Matt Campbell, which should really come as no surprise, because this Matt Campbell era has been by far the most successful stretch of Iowa State football in history. Really not even close. He's already the all-time wins leader at Iowa State. And it feels like he hasn't been here that long, but this is his 10th season at Iowa State. So he's put a lot of players in the NFL. So there's some of these guys that are just going to be really obvious, and that's just kind of what it is. But there are other ones that I think will be less obvious that I think will be really interesting to talk about. So let's get into it. First up is quarterback. And was it going to be anybody else besides Brock Purdy? Brock Purdy is the all-time leader at Iowa State in essentially every single passing category. The only one he's not in the top, either the top guy or in the top three of is interceptions, in which he appears nowhere on the top five, which is remarkable, given that he has a tie for the most career passing attempts, the most season passing attempts. He owns most season passing attempts, and I believe the most career passing attempts. His volume is just a lot greater than any other Cyclone quarterback. So he has all the counting stats, all the efficiency stats, but he is nowhere in the top five as far as most interceptions thrown, which is pretty incredible. This was maybe the single easiest name on this entire list. There's a couple guys that I think are worthy of recognition, at least at quarterback. Brett Meyer and Austin Arnon both had very good careers at Iowa State. Brett Meyer left as the all-time leading passer. Certainly, if Brock Purdy didn't exist, he would absolutely be on the list here. Then the big name that I think Iowa State fans are going to throw out is Seneca Wallace. Seneca Wallace was only here 2 years. He was electrifying in that time. His efficiency stats aren't necessarily as good as we might like to remember. He was a good passer of the football, but he was turnover prone too. But also, like I said, he was only here for 2 years. So, did he put a lot of eyes on Iowa State that weren't on it at the time because of just how electrifying he was? Absolutely. No question about it. If you talk to real college football nerds, they all remember who Seneca Wallace was. But like I said, this is a cumulative thing. And frankly, Brock Purdy is so far head and shoulders above every single other person at this spot. There's not really a conversation to be had, but I do want to mention Brett Meyer, Austin Arnaud, both had good careers. Sam Richardson should have had a better career if he had a better offensive coordinator, and just a better offense to work in. I will go to my grave believing that Sam Richardson could have been Brock Purdy in Matt Campbell's system. This is no doubt clear number one, Brock Purdy for the all quarter century team for quarterback. The running back one is probably going to be fairly easy, but it's not as clear cut as the other ones. Breece Hall gets the nod at running back. I know this one feels fairly obvious. He left Iowa State. Not quite as the all-time leading rusher because he was only here for 3 seasons, and he didn't get quite the volume that Troy Davis did. But I think most people consider him, if they don't consider him the best running back in Iowa State history, it is only after Troy Davis. Troy Davis is obviously not eligible for this list, but to be quite frank, I think even if Troy Davis was eligible for this list, I think I would still give the nod to Breece Hall. Remarkable career. He was the best running back in college football, arguably for his sophomore and junior seasons, and was just a dominant force, even behind an offensive line that was kind of sketchy at times. It's the only other guy that's in really significant consideration for this is Dave Montgomery. Now, Dave Montgomery is right there. He's right there with Breece Hall. You could argue that his impact on the program, as far as taking it from what it was to where it is now, maybe was even greater than Breece's. But if you're just talking about overall productivity, prestige within the around the country, and then now in the NFL, though David's put himself to put together a nice career in the NFL too. So it's. You could go. You could put Dave Montgomery here, and I don't think you would really feel. I don't think you would feel. Few if any disagreements about that. I don't think anybody would have an issue putting Dave Montgomery on this team over Breece Hall. Just like when you're talking about the best running back in Iowa State history, it is those three and only those three. It is Troy Davis, Breece Hall, Dave Montgomery, and you can frankly order them you can order them any way you want to, and there's a really good argument to be made for it. And Breece Hall and Dave Montgomery just happen to follow up each other and right back to back. So it's one of those. I'm giving the nod to Breece Hall because I think he was just slightly more individually dominant than David was. But gosh, David was such a good player. Absolutely deserves honorable mention. Other guys that I think are worth noting here, Stevie Hicks, rest his soul. Stevie Hicks was a really nice running back here, especially under the late stage Dan McCarney. The last time they were ranked in the McCarney era when they went to West Point and played at Army, I specifically remember that game. Nice player, nice running back. Um, it just doesn't quite stack up to the other guys. Alexander Robinson had a nice career at Iowa State. Just it was kind of in an era where Iowa State was just under Paul Rhodes, where they were fine. They were kind of the plucky underdog, but they weren't anything incredible. Early, or if you look in the early 2000s, you're looking at like Darren Davis, or I guess he would have been late 90s, so he wouldn't have been eligible for this. If you want to talk about guys that are kind of interesting names, like Hiawatha Rutland and Ennis Haywood, another both of them actually rest their souls. It's what it's again they're good running backs. They can't be in the same conversation as Breece Hall and Dave Montgomery. Duke says Breece was the more explosive of the two running backs, but if I'm being honest, David was more fun to watch. Honestly, I don't even necessarily disagree with you there. David Montgomery was so much fun to watch because he could turn nothing. He could turn a negative 2-yard run into a 5-yard run. He could turn 2 into 20. And he wasn't as explosive as Breece was, didn't have the breakaway speed, but gosh, watching David evade and break tackles was art. That 2017 Iowa game, unfortunately they lost that one, but man, his performance against Iowa that game was unbelievable. That was really his coming out party. We're like, holy shit, this guy can play. And turns out he can, and the NFL figured that out too. And then David's been, arguably a top 10 back in the league since he got there. And he's turned out a nice career, and he'll be playing, as a running back. He has a contract, into his 30s, which is a big deal. But I say I'm going to give the nod to Breece Hall here, but you could tell me Dave Montgomery, and I would have no qualms with that whatsoever. Okay. Next up is wide receiver, and this one is a much more difficult conversation here. There are a lot of good names for Iowa State over the last 25 years. You look back towards the beginning of the Dan McCarney era. You've got a few guys. Lane Danielson left Iowa State as the all-time leading receiver, and then you go towards mid to late stage Dan McCarney, and you've got Todd Blythe, who I think a lot of people growing up, like me, that grew up in the 90s. I was born in 1992, and you grow up in the 90s, and then you kind of really develop that consciousness around college football where you start really like understanding it and being able to follow it. You develop that, right in the early 2000s, mid 2000, frankly, right around like that Insight Bowl win with Sage Rosenfels and all them. That's kind of where you really start developing your consciousness around what's going on then. And the first guy after that showed up that you were like, damn, this guy's really great, was Todd Blythe. 6'4" receiver. He made his career. He's a very physical guy. Was just mossing guys, right? When Randy Moss was still in the league. Making one-handed catches. Just a fantastic receiver. And frankly, I think up through the end of the McCarney era, and frankly, and even the Gene Chizik era, if you want to call it that, 2 years of Gene Chizik, up until Paul Rhodes, he was up until Alan Lazard. I think you'd make a pretty good argument that he was the best receiver in Iowa State history. Even if wasn't the receptions leader, just dominance. Todd Blythe was awesome. Including that four receiving touchdown game down in College Station against Texas A&M when they blew out A&M. That was cool. But the first one up is one on our list here, which is Alan Lazard. And I'm going to spoil the other one, which is Xavier Hutchinson. So Alan Lazard is the first one of these that comes up. Alan Lazard was a hometown kid from Urbandale, mid 4-star guy, was highly recruited out of college, got a late offer from Notre Dame. They were really, really pushing for him. Went to Iowa State. Kind of the rest is history. Played under Paul Rhodes for a couple years, and even though the team was bad, Alan was very good. Then he got to play for Matt Campbell for a couple years, and was an instrumental part of that 2017 team that we saw really help Iowa State turn the corner and become now a consistent winning football program that they are now. I don't think you can tell the story of Iowa State football without talking about Alan Lazard and his impact of the receiver position and on the program as a whole. I don't think you can have that conversation without Alan Lazard. Has to be there. He left Iowa State as the all-time leading receiver. And it's just one of those, he's got to be in the conversation. He's got to be in here. The second name here was originally the second name here was the one I was having difficulty with. But as I started thinking about guys like Todd Blythe and Lane Danielson, and then like Hakeem Butler, and now Jaden Higgins and Jalen Knoll, lots of great names here. Especially like Jalen Knoll, who did play 4 years and was productive for 4 years. The couple guys that I ruled out, I ruled out a little bit earlier in this were Jaden Higgins and Hakeem Butler. Hakeem Butler did stay at Iowa State for the minimum 3 years to get to the NFL draft. Actually, he was here for he was here for 3 years. But really, he had an okay 17. He had kind of maybe it called a breakout or whatever, but 18 was his deal. Like he was unbelievable for the 2018 season. Set the Iowa State single season receiving mark with like 1,300 and change yards through the air. Amazing season, but it was really just that one season. Then you get Jaden Higgins, who had a spectacular year this last year, and it was really good the year before that, but was only here for 2 years. Now, I mean, you could argue maybe legacy there. He gets drafted early in the second. He gets drafted really early in the second round, and they get the Pop-Tart Bowl win there. There's a lot of arguments to be had there. However, I think you have to go with Xavier Hutchinson here, because Xavier Hutchinson in 3 years, he was at Iowa State for 3 years. In 3 years, did become Iowa State's all-time leading receptions, all-time leader in receptions, which I think is a huge deal. I mean, he passed Allen Lazard by 13 receptions in one fewer season. Now, granted, Xavier Hutchinson had better quarterback play for consistently across 3 years than Allen Lazard did for one, or for essentially 2 years under Matt Campbell, and the first 2 years under Paul Rhodes were a little rough. But in 3 years, Xavier Hutchinson was more productive than Allen Lazard was over 4, which I think is remarkable. Xavier was he was so productive, and he caught everything. He was asked to be the only guy that was able to catch footballs for a couple of years there. 2020, he came in as a JUCO and was immediately good. 2021, he was very good. 2022 there, he had a night. He was good. He was very good. Hunter Deckers was not great. But he just caught a million passes, and he was frankly the only one that he was really the only one that roster that you felt like could really be that number one guy, and they used him a lot. And that part of that contributes to his counting stats and the reason that he became Iowa State's all-time leading receiver in terms of receptions. But it's one of those where he was asked to shoulder an incredible load by himself, and he did it. He did it incredibly. And there's a couple of I've seen a couple comments here. It should be between Xavier and Knoll. The long-term production was best between them. Hakeem was the best wide receiver in college football, arguably in 2018. I think you hit the nail on the head there. Hakeem's 1 year in 2018 was unbelievable. Higgins was great. It's between Xavier and Hutchinson and Jalen Knoll. I think I'm giving it to Xavier. I mean, frankly, only on the basis that he was incredibly consistent and productive every single game of his Iowa State career. And it was for 3 full seasons, which, if Hakeem Butler's available to be considered for this, then Xavier Hutchinson is here. He was here the same amount of time. Jalen Knoll, he had a decent freshman year. People kind of, I don't know if you remember or not, but his sophomore year, he struggled a lot with drops, especially. And we were just kind of like, I'm not sure what's going on here. Then he became, a 1,000-yard receiver, in the 3rd round pick and all this. But he did struggle a little bit earlier in his career. And I'm not trying to dig at Jalen, but if you're really splitting hairs between Xavier Hutchinson and Jalen Knoll as far as putting them on this team, Xavier Hutchinson's, his graph of production is much more steady. And, there was never a stretch with Xavier Hutchinson where you were wondering if he was the guy, or if you're wondering if he was going to pan out. There was never a question with Xavier. He was just so good, so consistent. I mean, yeah, like I said, this was one of the hardest positions to pick, just because I would say it's had a lot of good players at the wide receiver position. Next up is the tight ends. The first one here is very obvious, and that is Charlie Kolar. The second one here is a little bit less obvious, and it took me a little bit of consideration. It took me a little bit of digging around just to kind of see, because Dan McCarney did use his tight ends a little bit. Paul Rhodes did a little bit, except for like right at the end. I'm going to give the nod to EJ Bibbs here, though. So this is our first non-Campbell player that has come up. Talk about Charlie Kolar a little bit. He's the best tight end in Iowa State history in terms of production, in terms of what he's done in the NFL so far and what he's going to be doing in the NFL. I think this is a no-brainer. He was, arguably he was the most consistent, receiving option on the team essentially his entire career. He was great. I don't think there's really an argument against Charlie Kolar. The second one here was an interesting one. You could make arguments for a couple other, Campbell guys. Chase Allen is up there. Maybe you could even make an argument that even though his receiving numbers aren't there, just in terms of overall impact, you could talk about Dylan Sainer, I think. You could go back to the McCarney era and look at a guy like Ben Barkema, who was, somewhat productive, and you had Walter Nickel there. He was fine. And then there was a couple other guys. But I just think EJ Bibbs, I was looking this up. I didn't realize this. If you look at Iowa State's single season receptions leader, let me just pull this up. I can throw this on here so everyone can see the records that I'm looking at here. Okay, it might be a little tough to see. I'll try to zoom in here because it's all in a PDF. But if we go up here to the single season leaders here, and we look at, let's see, receiving touchdowns. Let's see here. What am I doing? Oh, that's freshman records. All right, let's go back up here. Season records. There we are. Receptions by a tight end. So Colin Franklin was another guy I think deserved to be in consideration for this for sure. And maybe it should be Colin Franklin over EJ Bibbs, because Colin Franklin did play here for 4 years and EJ Bibbs was a JUCO guy. But then you look here, single season touchdown receptions, 8 of them right there. And that was with really bad quarterback play. Colin Franklin at least had the benefit of like Austin Arnaud, who was a competent quarterback. I think that's what, you could split hairs there between Colin Franklin and EJ Bibbs. I'm going to give the nod to EJ Bibbs partially on the partial basis too, because I think this is tough. EJ Bibbs, Colin Franklin, Chase Allen, Dylan Sainer, they all contributed in different ways. And it's really hard to decide who the second guy is here. Because if you're looking at receptions by a tight end in a season, Colin Franklin's right there, but EJ Bibbs was right behind him. That's shout out Keith Krepfel down here. It's tough because they all did different things. They were asked to do different things on their own team. I want to see, do they have receptions by a tight end broken out like they did earlier? So they've got receiving yards, touchdown catches, consecutive games of reception. Maybe not. Rushing yards. This is tough because how do you measure? So receiving yards by a tight end, look right here. I think and they're right there. There's Colin Franklin, there's EJ Bibbs. Colin Franklin did it for 4 years, but EJ Bibbs was essentially as productive in 2 years. And he also had a small, short NFL career and stuff like that too. So that's part of it. Let me pull this up just a little bit. Wait, can I make, where my layout go? This is crazy. Okay. So anyways, you looking by receiving yards by a tight end, Colin Franklin's there, but EJ Bibbs is right behind him, and he was much more productive. Chase Allen is right there behind both of them, and he played for 4 years, but also like was a huge. Or he played for 5 years, but was also a big factor in the run blocking game. Um, this is such a good take. I love this. EJ Bibbs deserved for play for Matt Campbell. If EJ Bibbs played if he played in the offense that Charlie Kohler got to play in, where they were really throwing to the tight end, I think EJ Bibbs is an incredibly talented player that I think probably has a really nice career um, at Iowa State, and maybe is right up there with Charlie Kohler in terms of career receiving yards and all that. I think he's probably right up there. So I'm gonna let's see receptions by tight end. Yeah, I mean EJ Bibbs had three. If you look right here, EJ Bibbs had three fewer receptions in a few years. I'm getting more comfortable with EJ Bibbs here. Um, Chase Allen, I think, is a perfectly good and worthy honorable mention here, but I'm going to go with EJ Bibbs because he did, like I said, he did play in the NFL a little bit and was really, really productive in a couple years, and frankly, just deserved to play in a better, more tight end friendly offense. Okay, offensive line. I didn't make a separate graphic for either of these because for some of these because I think there's some obvious names here and some other ones that you have to dig a little bit more. The obvious left tackle here is Kelechi Osemele, played for Paul Rhodes, was an early pick, was eventually, he was one of the best linemen in college football, was drafted after the 2011 season, played a long time in the NFL, was at one point the highest paid lineman in NFL history. Not much needs to be said there. It's Kelechi Osemele at left tackle. At left guard, once you get to the interior offensive line, you start kind of splitting hairs a little bit because some of these guys don't get as much fanfare, even as the tackles. You could look at a guy like Trevor Downing, who played a good chunk of his career at guard and then eventually moved to center. You could look at a guy like Oni Amoyle, who was right there. Hayworth Hicks was also another Kelechi Osemele's running mate there on the left side at left guard there. There's some McCarney guys that you could throw in there as well. I think at left guard, I think I'd like to go Trevor Downing, just because he played for a long time. He played mostly left guard, but then eventually moved into center. Was really good for his entire career. Essentially, was kind of an Iron Man. Didn't really miss time very much. Thought that I think he's worthy of that left guard spot. At center, we're gonna go Tom Farniok here, early Paul Rhodes era guy. You could see when you had Tom Farniok on the field, he was, this is going to be kind of a cliche example here, but he really was Iowa State's Jason Kelce. He's calling out blitzers. He's marking guys on defense. He's helping the quarterback, adjust protections and things like that. You could see when Farniok was in there and pointing stuff around, Iowa State's offensive line was very cohesive. But then as soon as he left Iowa State, it dropped off big time. And you could see like, damn, I wish we had a Tom Farniok. You'll even hear Cyclone fans, nowadays talk about how they wish we had a Tom Farniok at center who was he's the guy. You trust him to lead that entire group. He can lead from the middle, and that's just what it's going to be. And you're going to feel really good about it. So it's going to be Tom Farniok there for me. Right guard, I believe this is where Hayworth Hicks. I think he also played some at right guard. So we'll put Hayworth Hicks at the right guard. He did get some NFL camp invites, and was on that line with Kelechi Osemele. Left and right guard, you can kind of swap around however you want. So we're gonna put Hayworth Hicks on that right guard spot. Right tackle is an interesting conversation. Tyler Miller is currently at Iowa State right now. He's in his 6th year. He's generally played pretty well his entire career. You hate to kind of just move guys around because you can. Julian Good-Jones played a lot of snaps all over the offensive line. He played. I think he started games at basically every single spot. You could put Julian Good-Jones there at right tackle. Actually, a guard that he didn't play at Iowa State long enough, but a guard that could get some consideration is Josh Knipfel. He was a JUCO transfer, but he was really good for a few years there. At tackle, you could go Tyler Miller. You could go Julian Good-Jones. If you wanted to take a left tackle and just put him at right tackle, you could take like a Carter Bykowski, who ended up playing a little bit in the NFL. You could take now Jalen Travis. I think if you wanted to take, Jalen Travis only played left tackle for Iowa State, so I think you can't really put him in over Kelechi Osemele, especially because he only played 1 year as well. So that's not, that doesn't help him at all. Right tackle, I think I want to go. I don't know. And it's certainly possible that I'm missing a name here too. Because like I said, offensive line isn't necessarily my specialty. But I'm gonna go Tyler Miller here. This is his sixth year in the program. He started a million games for Iowa State, and he's generally been very good. Um, I don't have a ton to offer on this one, but I'm gonna put Tyler Miller there on longevity and just relative consistency. Okay, now we're going to move to the defensive side of the football. Again, I think these are two very obvious names, but there are some very worthy honorable mentions in this. The two names are going to be Will McDonald and Jaquan Bailey, both Matt Campbell guys. Jaquan Bailey came in early, Matt Campbell, and set the tone on the defensive line, especially for Eli Rashid's group. Left Iowa State as the all-time sacks leader. Not much to expound beyond that, except for the only reason that he is no longer the all-time sacks leader is Will McDonald, who left as the Big 12's all-time sacks leader, not just Iowa State's, but for the Big 12 conference. He left as the all-time leader in sacks. He was the most dominant pass rusher in college football. His last season at Iowa State, I, you know, one of the most unblockable defensive players I've ever seen at the college level. And he's now turning it on in the NFL, and he had a really nice 2024. And I think a lot of people have a very high hopes for him going forward. Jaquan Bailey didn't stick around the NFL as long, but I believe he was at one point was or is on a NASCAR pit crew, which is very interesting. But both of these guys left Iowa State as all-time sacks leader. They were guys that you had to scheme around on defense. I don't know. They're like, as far as the two guys on this list, I don't think there's a lot of argument. Now, there were guys that did have some individual seasons or, were interesting players or had some individual seasons that were very good. Talking about a guy early in Matt Campbell's career that had a really good season, which was Dale Pearson. He had, I think he before Will McDonald broke it, I believe he held the single season sack record for a while, for a few years there. That was, he had a great season, but it was really just, a season. You look at a guy like JD Wagner had a really nice stint at Iowa State. Corey Morrissey had a very good stint at Iowa State. I'm looking up the single season sacks record here. I'm gonna pull this back up. Single season sacks. Eni Wazirike was a guy I really thought about for this list. I really, really thought about Eni Wazirike for this list, but it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly where to put him on the line because they kind of moved him around a little bit. He did play a lot of nose tackle, which at his spot, with his pass rushing ability was a really big deal for Iowa State. The guy that did hold the record was Sean Moorhead. I think he absolutely deserves some honorable recognition here. He was Iowa State's all-time sacks leader. A couple of guys here. Reggie Hayward had a nice season there. A guy that a lot of people like to remember, maybe doesn't have the numbers here, but a guy that a lot of people like to remember, another one, rest his soul, is Jason Berryman. Was a really dominant force there for a little bit. Really interesting player. But I think you got to go with Will McDonald and Jaquan Bailey here. Just too productive for too long. Will McDonald obviously owns both of the top two marks for single season sacks, stealing it from Eni Wazirike, who would have had the single season mark. I said Will McDonald is easily on this list. Jaquan Bailey, I think, is also pretty safely on this list, defensive end. But I said Sean Moorhead, Corey Morrissey, JD Wagner, Sean Moorhead, a few other guys that had nice stints at Iowa State, but maybe just weren't as individually productive as other guys. The other defensive line spot. So I guess I should clarify this. I spoiled it with Brent Curvey, big play Brent Curvey. But the criteria I'm using, the way I'm setting up my defense here is, Iowa State's best defense of all time essentially is, Reggie Hayward is a great name there for the Dukester. I set this up in John Haycock's 3-3-5 because that has been the defense of this era of Iowa State. That is the defining defense of the 21st century Iowa State football. So I think we're going to set it up in John Haycock's scheme. So you've got two defensive ends, a nose tackle, three linebackers, three safeties, and two corners. our defensive lineman here, our nose tackle is Brent Curvey. Brent, there's a few different names here. Any Wazirike was absolutely in the conversation here, but he did play enough. He did play enough defensive end that I think it was kind of too much back and forth. Kind of like kind of like if you were talking about baseball and you were trying to figure out if Mookie Betts was the best right fielder or the best second baseman in the game. He might be both, but you have to pick one. And if his time is split too much, then you can't necessarily put him at either one. Um, but it's you know he's worthy of consideration, frankly, for either defensive end or nose tackle, if especially defensive end, if Will McDonald and Jaquan Bailey weren't there, or if at least Will McDonald wasn't there. But I did want to go with big play Brent Curvey at the nose tackle spot. He was an absolute wrecking ball. On the defensive line there, was outstanding. He's a guy that you had to really plan around him. There you go, 7 sacks in a season. And 7 sacks in a season from a defensive tackle, from an interior defensive line spot, is very impressive. Just as I mentioned with Andy Wazirike there. Had the fumble return against Baylor, for a touchdown. Just an absolute wrecking crew there. On a couple Iowa State teams that were, underachieving. Well, I guess I shouldn't say 2006 wasn't underachieving. They were in contention to make the Big 12 title game that year. But I really like Brent Curvey here. A couple other guys I think though that definitely got consideration for me. I had Ray Lima typed in here to start with. He was a transfer, but played 3 years here, and was instrumental in those the late aughts teams, the 2017, 18, 19 teams. Was really, really good. He's instrumental in making those defenses work by plugging up the middle. He had a great career here. I think you could absolutely look at a RJ Singleton. Had a great career here. You could, if he was at the end of this year, if we were doing this at the end of next season, you could look at Dominique Orange, I think, as being in this conversation. If you look at older guys, Jake McDonough had a really nice career here. There's a number of guys at this spot, but I wanted to go Brent Curvey. I think he's worthy of this. Also, just a really fun name. Who doesn't love big play Brent Curvey? So we are going to go with that for our defensive tackle / nose tackle spot. All right, linebacker is another one that is a difficult one to parse out. I think there's 3 that float to the top, but gosh, there's a lot of names that are at least worthy of being talked about here. Our linebacking crew is going to be AJ Klein, Mike Rose, and Jake Knott. I think these are 3 that make a lot of sense. I think those are the 3, the cream that rises to the top a little bit. But gosh, it would, like, AJ Klein was the first name I put down, but there are so many names on this list that you could talk about that, I think deserve consideration here. If you start the most recent and go back, Jake Hummel played right alongside Mike Rose, and you could argue was every bit as good as Mike Rose was. I think Jake Hummel could absolutely have a conversation for this. You look at Marcel Spears. Gosh, he had a good career at Iowa State, especially in the early part of the Campbell eras. Early part of the Campbell era, I think you would talk to those guys and be like, yeah, Marcel Spears was instrumental in making this whole thing work. You can't hardly tell the story about early Matt Campbell defense, or early John Haycock / Matt Campbell defenses without talking about Marcel Spears. And then you keep going back just a little bit further, and you get Jeremiah George, was really good for Paul Rhodes. He was really great right after AJ Klein and Jake Knott. Jeremiah George had a great career, and he played in the NFL a little bit. And I believe he's the he's an assistant strength coach or a linebackers coach at Texas. I believe. I don't know if he still is there or not, but he was at one point. But great career at Iowa State. Then obviously you go back to the Jake Knott, AJ Klein era. Jesse Smith had a nice little career before those 2 got there. You go back a little bit further and you go back to Alvin Bowen, who led the NCAA in tackles from the middle linebacker spot and then played for the Bills for a while. More than just a cup of coffee in the NFL. And then you go back just a little bit further and you go to Tim Dobbins, who was a tackling machine and also played in the NFL for quite a while. was kind of just spent like a decade in the NFL just on, on practice squads and on the, on the depth chart for the Chargers and things like that. You can go back and forth. You can go back and back and back, you know, that you can keep picking up guys. Luke Knott's an interesting name. The problem is he dealt with so many injuries his career. I mean, frankly, like his brother Jake. Um, but Luke dealt with so many injuries in his career. I would be curious to know what Luke Knott looks like on this, what his career looks like if he can stay healthy for all 4 years. I think he's a really interesting name in this, talent wise. But if you're looking at just the guys that, put the career together, were just so good at their position, I think it's got to be these three. AJ Klein, I think, is the best name out of any of these. Had an incredibly productive career, then went on to play, over a decade in the NFL. I think he has an argument. He has one of the, maybe the best linebacker of all time in Iowa State. He's in the conversation right there with Matt Blair, as far as the best linebacker in school history. It's right there. And Jake, and then let me pull up my records again. So if you go down to your career records for tackles, let me pull this up here. You will notice a couple guys. So Chris Washington, Keith Schrader, there's AJ Klein right there at 361, and there's his buddy Jake Knott right there, right behind him at 347. Those two were an unbelievably productive linebacking group, and they were truly the face of those Paul Rhodes programs. Though AJ Klein and Jake Knott, they were the best linebacking duo. You could probably argue the best linebacker duo in college football there for a year or two. They were unbelievably good, and I like, you can't really talk about one without talking about the other, in terms of just what they did in an Iowa State uniform. There's the legendary story of Jake Knott during the Baylor game his senior season, dislocated his shoulder in the game and then went to the sideline and popped it back in himself and then played the rest of the game. And I think I've heard that he did it twice in that game too, but I don't know for sure. I know he at least did it once, where he popped his shoulder back in himself and then went back right into playing. The guy, eventually ended up being to his detriment. But I think, man, Jake Knott's just an unbelievable player, alongside AJ Klein. Mike Rose came in, started as a true freshman for Matt Campbell, was an excellent middle linebacker his true freshman year, was asked to move outside, which was out of position for him, and just had continued to have one of the most productive, careers that an Iowa State linebacker has ever had. Had a shot at the NFL, may still at some point, but gosh, he's what a player Mike Rose was. Like I said, there's a number of other guys that are really interesting here, but I think those are just the three that I think float to the top. Okay, here is another extremely difficult position for Iowa State, which is cornerback. So cornerback has a number of names here. Like I said, there's a couple that float to the top. I had to pick two, but I think you could make an argument for a really good argument for four of them. I just had to kind of pick the two that felt right. And you could maybe say a fifth one, depending on which position you put him at, because he kind of went back and forth a little bit. I did include him on this list, just not at this position. So my two corners on this team are Ellis Hobbs and TJ Tampa. Ellis Hobbs was an early 2000s guy for Dan McCarney. He was an excellent all-around guy, return kicks and punts, but was just a really good corner. John Gruden name-checked him in his little 5-minute spiel video last week. He was just a really good corner, played in the NFL for quite a long time. Just a great athlete. Not necessarily a lot to say about him necessarily, other than that he was just a really good corner. I was going to see if I could find, I believe he's on Iowa State's career interceptions list. He's right up there. So Ellis Hobbs, well, he's actually not, but Jake Knott actually is. Oh no, Ellis Hobbs there is. He's sitting at 6th with 9. So he is the leader in interceptions on anybody that's played since 2000, by himself, right ahead of Jake Knott. Really great corner right there. TJ Tampa is who I went with the other one. TJ played 4 years here and was just really good for all four of them. He was a true 100% lockdown TJ, Tampa Island. I mean, honestly, frankly, his last 2 years at Iowa State earned him an early, a day 2 pick in the NFL draft where he's playing with the Ravens now, and I believe they really think he's going to jump up. A couple guys here though. There are a couple guys. Yeah. So Dukester he found one of the guys that is I was right there with him, and I went with TJ Tampa. Leonard Johnson is absolutely one of them. Was one of Iowa State. Was Iowa State's best defensive player. Up until AJ Klein and Jake Knott got there, or until they really took off. Leonard Johnson was arguably the best defensive player. He was a very good corner. He was on that. Is an instrumental part of that 2011 team. Returned punts and kicks. Great player. Even had spent some time, a decent amount of time in the NFL. This is the difference between TJ Tampa and Leonard Johnson, I think, is splitting hairs. If you had to ask me to pick one for a team, I think I'd probably take TJ Tampa because he's a little bit bigger and more athletic. But I mean, in terms of production and what they meant to their teams, Leonard Johnson wasn't necessarily as much of the shutdown corner, but he picked off more passes, I think. But I mean, TJ Tampa just eliminated the side of the field. Leonard, like I said, there's 4 of them. There's 4 corners that you can consider for these 2 spots. I just kind of had to pick 2 of them. And maybe you could say TJ Tampa is some recency bias, but I think, I think he's worthy of that spot. But Leonard Johnson certainly has a great argument. The 4th guy here that I think deserves a shout out, deserves recognition here is Brian Peavy. Was late Paul Rhodes, early Matt Campbell guy. A little undersized, but played really well. He was a good shutdown corner. Just did a great job there. Played a long time, played a lot of snaps. Just a super productive guy as far as, doing his job. When Brian Peavy was on the field, you knew he had his guy locked down. You were never worried about him blowing a coverage or anything like that. Just super consistent. Brian Peavy, like I said, Brian Peavy is the 4th guy I think absolutely deserves consideration on this list. But if you wanted to throw some other names in there, I mean, you could absolutely throw in Miles Purchase, who just finished up a long career at Iowa State and, essentially played. He started ever since he was a sophomore and then started really towards the end of his freshman year too. Great question about the Dukester. Will John Tez be here after his career? If he continues on the same track he's on right now, I think John Tez Williams is probably on this. I think he's probably up here with Ellis Hobbs. If he continues on this pace as far as picking off passes and stuff like that. If he takes the jump this year that I think a lot of people expect him to take, in becoming a real shutdown corner, more than just an opportunistic corner that picks off passes and really just start to shut down the side of the field. I think John Tez will be on this. He'll be at minimum, he'll be the 5th name in this group that really deserves a spot in this too. But I think I certainly think he's on pace right now to pass TJ Tampa and take this 2nd spot, or maybe even the 1st, and maybe just shuffle everybody down and take the number 1 spot here. He's off to an unbelievable start in his career. And I think, if he takes the leap this year, I think a lot of people think he can take this. He'll be in consideration for this spot. So like I said, lots of really interesting names. You could go back. You could go back to back to the McCarney era as well, and grab a few other guys. I'm right now. I'm completely blanking on the guy. He played right across from Ellis Hobbs, but was an excellent player back then too. Actually, I just want to look this up real quick because it's going to bother me if I don't. I want to see he was on like the 2004 ish team. Like DeAndre something. Why can I not think of this? This is going to drive me nuts. So, okay, so we get to 2006 is a little too late. DeAndre Jackson is the other one I was thinking of. Really, he was a really nice player. alongside Ellis Hobbs. Just didn't get as much uh, didn't get as much love because it was just the guy he was running alongside. But was a really nice player. Or no, sorry, not DeAndre Jackson. Lamarcus Hicks. That's who I was thinking of. Lamarcus Hicks, very good corner. Is he one of the two best corners of the past 25 years? I don't know. But he's another like absolutely an honorable mention guy. Lamarcus Hicks, great player. Um, yeah, I think he's right there. Okay. Safety spot. Another very difficult group for Iowa State because they've had a number of very good safeties. Um, these guys, but my three here are all Matt Campbell guys, somewhat to my chagrin because there are some Paul Rhodes and even Dan McCarney guys I think that I want to shout out because I think they were very good in their own right. But first name on here, I mean, like I said, all three of these are Matt Campbell guys. We'll just do them all at once. You get Bo Freeler, Greg Eisworth, and Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson obviously spent the good part, the good portion of his earlier career as a corner. You could have absolutely made him one of the corners here. But he did finish as a safety, and because of that, I'm gonna put him there because I think he deserves to be on this team, either as a corner or a safety. But I wanted to, I felt like Ellis Hobbs and TJ Tampa were better corners than Anthony Johnson was. But Anthony Johnson, just as a defensive back, needed to be on this team. So I put him at safety. Bo Freeler just finished his career. I don't think you would, Matt Campbell has talked about Bo Freeler at great length about how he just is what Matt Campbell wants Iowa State football to be. The true Iron Man. He never missed games. And frankly, he robbed himself of an NFL career because he just refused to bow down to injury, and he just played through everything and was just the ultimate leader and the guy you want on your defense. Bo Freeler has to be on this list. Is he like the most important or the best Iowa State's safety in Iowa State history? Maybe. I think there's other guys that you could absolutely throw into that conversation. But as far as the Matt Campbell era and the last 25 years ago, you cannot tell the story of Iowa State football in the Matt Campbell era without talking about Bo Freeler. Greg Eisworth, I think, he kind of gets slept on a little bit because I actually don't really know why he gets slept on a little bit, but he kind of does. Greg Eisworth, he was originally a transfer. He started at Ole Miss, was a JUCO guy, and then eventually, he played at Iowa State for, I want to say, was he here for 4 years? Even as a JUCO transfer, he played here forever. Let me pull that up just real quick. He led the team in tackles in 2018 that I just saw. So he played 4 years at Iowa State. Via his COVID year. But he racked up a lot of tackles there, racked up on, a number, didn't pick up a lot of passes. He only picked off 5 passes, but he was a guy that you could always count on back there. He was good in run support. Like I said, did lead the team in tackles in a couple seasons. Was just, he was the bridge between, he was the guy in early Campbell era that got things stabilized on the back end which turned it over to Bo Freeler for the second era of, for the second half of Matt Campbell's era, of the Matt Campbell era. And I think Greg Eisworth was such a good player. I loved watching him play. Super nice guy. I got a chance to talk to him a little bit down in Dallas last year. Super nice guy. And I think he is worthy of this team. And as I mentioned before, Anthony Johnson is my other safety here. Like I said, I understand that he played his first, most of his career at corner and was a very, very good corner. But because Anthony Johnson finished off at safety, I'm going to put him here. This is a guy, like I said, that Matt Campbell has talked about at length, after at the end of his career, talked about at length that Anthony Johnson was a guy that always did everything. He did things the right way. He was one of those program culture setters and just personified everything you want a corner to be at Iowa State, and was an incredibly productive player. Just didn't, he didn't have a lot of, he didn't register his first career interception until his senior year. But part of that was because nobody threw at him for a couple years there. Then did finally play a very good safety position his senior year. Um, Absolutely deserves to be on this team, even if he did spend even if he did split his career between positions, absolutely deserves a spot on this team. So at safety, the other guys you can throw in this, there's a number of other like fun names that you can really throw into this conversation. Go back just a little bit to the Paul Rhodes era. I think Jaquez Washington played safety for a long time at Iowa State, was very good, very productive. He was a guy I really considered throwing on here with Jaquez Washington. Um, you could look at a guy like Dion Broomfield, who played a very good safety for Iowa State and is now the safeties coach at Iowa State. If you're just going off of the player, he doesn't quite make those lists, and that's why I left him off the list, because he was a good player, just maybe not as good as those three. Um, but now if you talk about his impact as a player and a coach, maybe he deserves to be on the list. You know, really interesting guy. We had a comment here. Dukester says Zach Sandvig was underrated. Absolutely. Zach Sandvig was a good player. One of my favorite players in the Dan McCarney era was Nick Mosier. He was a John Lynch type safety where he's just wrecking people over the middle. I think he did play some hybrid linebacker safety type thing. But I think he was mostly considered a safety, but no, Nick Mosier was a fun name there for a while. Kamari Cotton Moya had a very productive career for Paul Rhodes, and then toward the first part of the Matt Campbell era. Kamari Cotton Moya was really solid. He's a little bit vulnerable in deep coverage, but just a really solid safety. Did a really nice job. Malik Verdon, if he hadn't been hurt so much, I think would absolutely be in this conversation. Jeremiah Cooper is still playing, but if he can rebound and have another really good like an all Big 12 type of season, Jeremiah Cooper, at the end of next season is maybe on this list too. You can back. There's a couple guys that had short stints, like if you remember this name, Steve Paris, was there towards the late 2000s and played a couple really nice years for Iowa State, and then eventually got a shot in the NFL. Lot of names here at safety for Iowa State, but I think those are three that I feel really good about. Like I said, I think you can't tell the story of the Matt Campbell era really without talking about these three guys. Especially these would be my guys for safety. And I feel pretty good about that, but like I said, there's plenty of good names to throw out there for that position group. All right, just a couple spots left here. Kicker is going to be Cole Netten. Most accurate kicker in Iowa State history, was the all-time scoring leader until Breece Hall took that over. I don't think there's a really good argument here. We've had kickers have good individual seasons. But if you look over the span of a whole career, it's Cole Netten. It's not anybody else. It's Cole Netten. Yeah, I know like people like to look back fondly on like Brett Culbertson and stuff like that, but he was really more of kind of just the Iowa game. It's Cole Netten. Punter, Kirby Vanderkamp. He's a guy. Now I think Tyler Perkins, if he can continue to ascend, might be there. Tyler Perkins is currently the career active leader in punting average, but he's not done yet, so we're not going to throw him in on this just yet. Kirby Vanderkamp is the highest career punting average of the eligible players, and obviously Cyclone fans remember him fondly. He had a big leg. He could pin guys in the corner, and he was Paul Rhodes wasn't afraid to have him carry the ball and try to pick up first down on a couple fake punts. Kirby was a really fun player. I got no problem with putting Kirby here, even though he's got some of that, a little bit of that Steele Jantz type aura where he was just kind of a goofy player that kind of got used in a goofy way, but he was genuinely very good at his job. Kirby Vanderkamp absolutely deserves to be here. Let's look at some specialists. Kick returner is obviously Kanene Nwangu. Punt returner, Trevor Ryan. There's a few other guys here. Leonard Johnson was a very good kick returner, but he was really mainly just earlier in his career that he was returning kicks. You could look at Ellis Hobbs, who returned a bunch of kicks, but he's already on the team at corner, so I elected to not put him there. JJ Moses is an interesting name. There he was early 2000s, and his career overlapped into the 90s just a little bit, so I didn't put him, but I did very much consider JJ Moses for this spot. But Kanene Nwangu was an unbelievably good kick returner, and there's a reason that he is probably the best kick returner in the NFL right now. There's a reason for that. He was really good at his job. Trevor Ryan is an interesting. So Josh Lenz is an interesting name at punt return. I have no problem with putting Josh Lenz there, but if you look at Trevor Ryan, he's right there. If you look at career punt return touchdown, Trevor Ryan returned multiple punts for touchdowns. He is currently sitting. Let me pull this up. Actually, I can just show you. If you look here, look at our punt return stats right here. Trevor Ryan's right there, in punt return average. Funny enough that Alan Lazard there is in punt return average. He returned punts a couple times this freshman year. But you look here, Trevor Ryan is 4th in punt return average. Ryan Baum is up there. It's kind of weird. But he's also one of only a few guys to return multiple punts for touchdowns. Special teams touchdowns in general, he's right there. Jarvis West is an interesting one. Jarvis West is the only other player I think that's worthy of consideration as a kick returner. But it's got to be Trevor Ryan, I think, for that punt returner spot. He was just a really, really good player. So that is our Iowa State all-century team. Like I said, some of these were slam dunks, very easy guys to put in their spot. Brock Purdy, Will McDonald, guys like AJ Klein, guys like that, and lots of them that you're really splitting hairs, and you're just trying to figure. Sometimes it's just personal preference or who you grew up watching, or maybe just recency bias factors into these a lot. But like I said, lots of Matt Campbell guys, and deservedly so. There's a reason that this is the best era of this is the best stint of Iowa State football ever, and it's not even particularly close. And there's a reason that Iowa State players are really showing up in the league in high-profile positions. But Dan McCarney has a number of guys on there. Paul Rhodes has a couple guys on there, are at minimum that are worthy of consideration too. So interesting one. Appreciate the interaction and comments, and if just for funsies, who guys I want to, let's talk about guys that are on the current roster. Just to wrap up here, let's talk about guys that are on the current roster that I think are on track to, or could be, guys that end up on this list. So if you go kind of position by position here, Rocco Becht, unfortunately, is going to get pigeonholed here by Brock Purdy. Rocco is on he's on a good pace, but his next 2 years have to be unbelievable. He's going to have to probably win a Big 12 title, and he's going to have to be really pass the ball a lot to have a shot at unseating Brock Purdy. Probably not going to happen. Running back, I don't know if there's a guy on the roster right now. Dylan Lee and River Peppers both are they just haven't played, so you can't really even factor them in. Carson Hansen and Abu Sama are splitting time, so you're probably not going to get anything there. Wide receiver, there's some interesting guys, really interesting players on the roster. But the two top guys this year are transfers, and unless they are just truly remarkable, transcendent talents, are probably going to have a tough time. Tight end, if he can stay healthy the next couple years, I think Ben Bramer could be up here, depending on what they do with him, and if he can stay healthy. Cooper Alexander, I think, is talented enough to end up getting up here if he can stay healthy and he can do all the things he needs to do. You look at linebacker, Cale Brazina, Cooper Ebel, absolutely both in contention there to be, in that linebacker conversation if they continue to play well. We are not Jaquez to Washington, but John Tez Williams. We talked about him before on the team right now, absolutely on pace to potentially be on this list at some point. Jeremiah Cooper was another guy we mentioned that could be on this list at some point. Definitely some guys on the roster that I think have a shot. But we can't really evaluate them just yet. So it's going to be interesting to watch over the next few years, though, because there's just a lot of really talented players in the program right now. So I think we're going to wrap her up for everybody. Remember to like and subscribe here if you can. If you got comments on this, we should have thrown this guy in, you're dumb for putting this guy in. Really appreciate all the interaction we get on these, especially in the YouTube comments as well. If you're watching this on Twitter, we do appreciate you, but would also appreciate if you went over to YouTube and subscribe to the channel. It helps get these out to the algorithm a little bit more. It just helps people find this channel a little bit more. If you enjoy these conversations, you know, really appreciate anybody sharing the video and all that stuff. I love having these types of conversations. If you missed it last week, I had a few friends on and we each drafted a team of Big 12 players since 2010 to figure out who could come up with the most total offensive yardage for that player, the yards per scrimmage, I should say. And we had a really close draft there, and Derek Duke ended up taking that one. Definitely recommend watching that video if you haven't already seen it yet. It's a fun draft game for this. And I want to do more of those, and I want to do more of these types of things too. And we might do one for basketball too as well. So appreciate all the interaction. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments to see if there's a place that I messed up, or the just got what fun names to throw out there. Want to just do fun name check party. Appreciate it, but we will see you guys all again next week here on Iowa State Cyclones live here on the Voice of College Football Network. Subscribe over on YouTube. Check out the rest of the Voice of College Football Network if you're into that, if you're a real college football nerd. Next week, we'll probably have some more college football structural things to talk about as far as the house settlement and all that stuff goes, and maybe some sort of reformatting of the college football playoff. We'll see what all that comes along. But appreciate everybody for watching. We'll see you guys here next week on Iowa State Cyclones live here at the Voice of College Football Network. Thanks.